International Women's Day began in the early 1900s as, and I quote from the UN page for women, as a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. The day also marks a call to action for accelerating women's equality. I'm very pleased that 4 capital women, i.e. women from our congregation, were in a position to respond favorably to my request for them to talk about what International Women's Day means to them. Today, we can expect to be reminded of our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, as well as the third principle, the acceptance of one another. Our first speaker today is Joy Hubert, who has a story for us in our usual slot for Time for All Ages. And Joy will be followed by Sarah, who will take us to Ottawa and beyond Canada's borders. I will not come up in between. You don't need me again until after Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So in homage to my mother, Ruth Wood, who died in December 2020, I wore my female costume today because she always used to dress up, and sometimes in ways we found a little unsettling, like wearing a clown costume to a Quaker meeting. But we called it age inappropriate. So yes, my mother was born in 1935 in a very religious community. I was born when she was 21. When I was 15, I accepted Jesus as my personal savior, experienced full immersion baptism in the front of the church. And when I was 15, my mother was 35 or 36, and at that point, she became an atheist, just when I was saved. So she read a book by Bertrand Russell called Why I'm Not a Christian, and she thought, he's right, this is nonsense, although she didn't use the word nonsense. But anyway, she lived her life, the rest of her life, as a non-theist. Although religious conditioning runs deep, so she did end up as a Quaker. But I'm not really here to talk about my mother, but about my ancestor, Heidi Koop, who in 1990 wrote a book called The Hell of God's Call. This is a pretty fascinating document if you want to read about a tortured person. So when I was growing up, God was always talking to people and telling them what to do. Handy for making decisions. But when Heidi was 12, the Lord spoke to her and said he had a special purpose for her. And as time went on, that purpose became clear, that she was to enter the ministry. So she, as an adult, got a master's degree in divinity and started to look for work. But she could not achieve a job in the church at the time. And I'm just going to read a little bit from her memoir. She went to speak, she tried to get some advice from a pastor she knew. I was labeled an ecumaniac by the pastor of one of our largest churches. The tone was heavy with sarcasm, and the word maniac was hardly complimentary in my mind. No explanation was offered as to the meaning of that remark, and I smiled despite the hurt inside of me. I felt rejected and ignored by him and the church he represented. And so she kept trying, and she went on and had different contracts, and then she finally decided that one of the acceptable jobs for a female at that time was to write a Sunday school curriculum. So she did decide to do that. With no theological roadblocks, this should be acceptable for a woman. I contacted and discussed the possibility with a potential Mennonite publisher. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to put the word Mennonite in. Together we decided that I would submit some preliminary materials. His last words of advice were, I would suggest you write it together with Helmut Clausen. Why, I asked. You're a woman, it won't sell. Being repeatedly and actively discouraged or even overlooked in perusing church-related involvements, I had difficulty dealing with my feelings. When I was rejected without adequate explanation or on the basis of gender, I felt abused and angry. Such reality was difficult to accept. I now needed to look for employment outside of the church, and I felt I was breaking a commitment. God's first choice for me, as I still understood it, was in church-related work. My hopes were shattered, and my trust in the church faltered. I felt deserted even by God. So if I'd known her now, has died long ago, I think I could have helped her. Like, that church doesn't want you? Well, come to the Unitarians, hey? And I feel so privileged and so happy that I can enter this group as a full participant, regardless of gender. Thank you.
So I will also have a couple of women's stories, but I'll start with my own. When Karen asked if I wanted to speak today, I had one image that came right into my mind, which was the one that Amanda has up on the screen right now, of the famous five on Parliament Hill. And they stand and they sit amongst a sea of statues of men. And I've encountered them a few times. There's actually also a replica in Calgary where this was first put in Calgary, and it was a year later in Ottawa. And the first time I encountered them, I had shivers down my spine. I have these five women and other suffragettes like them to thank for the fact that I am now equal to men in my rights and my responsibilities as a citizen of Canada. And because of them, I can participate in Canada's political life. And Karen mentioned to me that links to the first principle. Their fight has given me equality of opportunity, but women are not there yet in terms of equity. There are many examples, from representation in government. In that parliament right there, we hold 30% of the seats. So from government representation to this one really astonished me, the fact that we are more likely to be injured in car accidents because car safety features work better for men than for women. We have to fight harder to be heard, to receive equal pay for equal work. And the one that horrifies me constantly, subject to misogyny, abuse, violence, and threats of all kind. And of course, that is the third principle. So for me, International Women's Day means there is much to celebrate and still a long way to go. As some of you know, I have focused on environmental projects over the years, and I feel there are many points of intersection between women's rights and environmental justice. And I want to highlight two women who brought this home for me. The first is this woman, Wangari Maathai, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for her work establishing Kenya's Greenbelt movement. And Maathai was an ardent advocate for women's well-being. I think that was her first passion was women's rights. And she saw the impact of environmental devastation, deforestation, and what they call desertification. I always stumble on that. The encroachment of the desert. She saw the impact of those environmental disasters on women. Soil was eroding, villages were struggling, and women were having to walk further and further to access water, to access wood for cooking fuel. So Maathai suggested planting trees as a means of slowing desertification and also helping women so that they didn't have to walk so far.
The Greenbelt movement, so this was the Greenbelt movement that she founded, and it has resulted in over 50 million trees being planted across Kenya. And soil erosion has slowed in some critical areas, and their lives have been improved to a degree. I think there's still a long ways to go. Now, the second story is closer to home, and this is an elder from the Shuswap, Mary Thomas. Mary Thomas overcame a traumatic youth that included residential schools and a traumatic young adulthood. Her first husband went to the Second World War and came back and quite traumatized and abused her. So she overcame those hurdles and became a knowledge keeper for her people and a respected authority nationally on traditional plants and their uses. I'd love to talk, I could talk a long time about Mary. With her knowledge of traditional plants, she became concerned about environmental degradation along the Salmon River, which flows into Shuswap Lake at Salmon Arm. And she overcame her shyness and began speaking publicly about her knowledge. Eventually, she became a leading force in establishing a multi-partner community roundtable which developed solutions, including planting the river shorelines. And at the same time, she worked on improving education for children in their early years, knowing how critical education is to the lives of women and their families. Now scholarships are awarded each year in BC to 2 Aboriginal early childhood education students. And I met her a few times, and every time I was very moved by her. She had the ability to speak from her heart, and there was no judgment. She just extended love unconditionally to those she was speaking with. And she also expressed her sense of spirituality and connectedness to the land. So before I close, I want to speak for a moment about International Women's Day and gender diversity. In my comments so far, I've used the term women. It is, after all, International Women's Day. But it's my hope that in our quest for equity for women and girls, we also include all gender diverse, gender fluid people, including trans, non-binary, and two-spirit. Just as we owe gratitude to the famous 5 and other suffragettes for enabling women's participation in Canada's political life, we owe it to gender diverse people to create equity for their participation in our political, economic, cultural, and social life. And as I say those words, I think of my young grandchild who was assigned the male gender at birth, who from a very young age, as young as 2, identified as a girl. So I hope that the women who advocate for International Women's Day stand for children and adults like my young grandchild. Thank you.